Sadie Adler is not your typical strong female character, and I think that's exactly what makes her so psychologically interesting. Because the game doesn't just give us a woman who can shoot and call it empowerment, it shows us the actual psychological process of trauma, survival, and identity reconstruction. We watch Sadie transform from a woman in a nightgown, traumatized and barely functional, into one of the most capable and ruthless members of the gang, and that transformation isn't simple. It's not clean. It raises uncomfortable questions about what survival costs, about whether adopting violence as your tool of agency is liberation or just assimilation into the system that hurt you in the first place. This is about what it actually looks like when someone rebuilds themselves after devastating loss, and whether that rebuilding is freedom or just another kind of cage. Let's get into it. The trauma, when your world shatters. When we first meet Sadie, she's in crisis. The O'Driscolls murdered her husband Jake right in front of her. They kept her captive in her own home, and when Arthur finds her, she's physically and psychologically shattered. That initial portrayal is clinically accurate for acute trauma response. She's withdrawn, not fully present, moving through the world in this dissociated fog. Her affect is flat. She's going through motions but not really inhabiting her body or her life. In trauma psychology, what we're seeing is the immediate aftermath of a severe traumatic event. Her nervous system is overwhelmed. The normal mechanisms for processing experience have completely broken down under the weight of what happened. The DSM-5 lays out criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and Sadie shows several of them clearly. Intrusive memories. She can't stop thinking about what happened. Avoidance. She initially wants nothing to do with violence or conflict. Negative alterations in mood and cognition. She's numb, disconnected, can't imagine a future, and hyperarousal. She's jumpy, alert to threat, can't relax. But here's what's crucial about Sadie's arc. She doesn't stay in that acute trauma state, and the game shows us the actual psychological process of working through trauma, not just a time skip to she's fine now. There's this concept in trauma psychology called post-traumatic growth. It was developed by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, and it describes how some people don't just recover from trauma, they actually grow through it. They develop new strengths, new perspectives, deeper relationships, greater appreciation for life. That's Sadie's trajectory. But the game is smart enough to show that post-traumatic growth isn't pretty. It's not about becoming a better, gentler person. Sometimes it's about becoming harder, more capable of violence, more willing to do terrible things because you've already lived through terrible things. Sadie's growth comes through reclaiming agency. She was helpless during the attack, couldn't protect her husband, couldn't protect herself. That helplessness is psychologically devastating. So her response is to ensure she's never helpless again. She learns to shoot, to fight, to track, to kill without hesitation. Every skill she develops is an answer to that original helplessness. You won't catch me defenseless again. You won't make me a victim again. This is adaptive coping in action. She's taking the trauma and integrating it into a new identity. Not forgetting it, not pretending it didn't happen, but building something functional on top of it. In narrative identity theory, there's this idea that we construct who we are through the stories we tell about ourselves. And Sadie actively rewrites her story. She goes from widow whose life ended when Jake died to survivor who will make them pay. That narrative reconstruction is psychologically crucial for moving forward. When she says, "I ain't done yet," she's not just talking about revenge, she's asserting continued existence, continued agency. I'm still here, I still matter, my story isn't over just because they tried to end it. That's meaning making, taking something senseless and violent and finding purpose in it. Not a good purpose necessarily, not a healthy one in the long term, but a purpose that lets you keep functioning when grief and trauma might otherwise paralyze you completely. Reclaiming the body. There's something specific happening with Sadie that we need to examine carefully. She reclaims her sense of agency and bodily autonomy through violence. Her body was violated, not sexually as far as we know, but through captivity, through forced witness to her husband's murder, through the complete loss of control over what happened to her physically. That violation creates this profound sense of your body being vulnerable, penetrable, not fully yours. And Sadie's response is to transform her body into a weapon, to make it capable of violence rather than just vulnerable to it. Every time she shoots someone, every time she fights, she's reasserting, "I control this body, I control what it does, you can't make me helpless." This is psychologically complex because violence becomes both the problem and the solution. The thing that traumatized her is now the tool she uses to process that trauma. In feminist trauma theory, there's extensive discussion about how women reclaim agency after violence, and there's tension between different schools of thought. Some argue that adopting violence just perpetuates cycles of harm. Others argue that in certain contexts, violence is the only language of power available, and refusing it means remaining powerless. Sadie exists in that tension. The game doesn't fully resolve it, and that's what makes it honest. She's not celebrated as purely empowered, and she's not condemned as having lost herself. She just is someone who survived by becoming dangerous. There's also something here about bodily autonomy in a broader sense. Throughout the game, Sadie repeatedly asserts control over what she does with her body, how she presents, what risks she takes. When people try to protect her or limit her, she pushes back hard. This isn't just stubbornness, it's a trauma survivor's refusal to have her choices taken away again. You already took my husband, my home, my safety. You don't get to take my decisions too. That fierce insistence on self-determination, even when it's self-destructive, is a recognizable trauma response. When control was violently stripped away, some survivors become almost compulsive about maintaining control over everything they can, even small things. Gender on the frontier. Performing and disrupting. Now we need to talk about gender. Because Sadie's character is doing something sophisticated with how gender works in this world, and understanding that requires some theoretical framework, there's a philosopher named Judith Butler who revolutionized how we think about gender with her theory of gender performativity. The basic idea is that gender isn't something you are, it's something you do. It's performed through repeated actions, behaviors, ways of speaking and moving and presenting yourself. And cultures have scripts for how gender should be performed. In the late 1800s American frontier, the script for women was very specific. Domesticity, passivity, emotional labor, dependence on men for protection, moral purity. These weren't just suggestions, they were enforced through social pressure and real consequences. When we first meet Sadie, she superficially fits that script: the nightgown, the helplessness, the need for rescue. This is frontier femininity in its most vulnerable, most proper form. But then Sadie starts changing her performance. She starts wearing men's clothing, carrying guns, using profanity, fighting, killing, all behaviors coded as masculine in this culture. And the game shows us the social friction that creates Dutch questions whether it's appropriate. Pearson is uncomfortable. Even Arthur sometimes doesn't quite know how to process it. Because Sadie's not following the script anymore, and that makes people uneasy. But here's what's sophisticated about how the game handles this. Sadie doesn't just become one of the boys. She's not trying to be a man. She's creating a hybrid gender performance that takes elements of both scripts and refuses to be constrained by either. She's still emotionally expressive in ways the men often aren't. She cries, she shows grief, she forms deep connections, but she does it while also being violent, profane, and refusing protection. She's reconfiguring what's possible, not just switching from one rigid category to another. This challenges the binary thinking that dominated frontier society. You're either a lady who needs protecting or you're not really a woman. Sadie's existence suggests a third option. You can be a woman and also be dangerous, capable, autonomous. And this connects to feminist standpoint theory. That's the idea that people who are marginalized in power structures actually have unique insight into how those structures work, because you see the contradictions, the arbitrary rules, the ways power maintains itself when you're on the receiving end of it. Sadie sees the gang's masculine codes clearly because she's outside them. She calls out the romanticization, the performative honor, the ego-driven conflicts. She's not buying into the mythology that the men tell themselves because she wasn't socialized into it the same way. When she points out that Dutch's philosophizing is bullshit, or that Arthur's sense of honor is selective, or that the whole gang is playing at being noble outlaws while just being criminals. She's using her position as an outsider insider to see what they can't see about themselves. The violence question: liberation or assimilation? But we need to sit with a difficult question. Is Sadie's transformation actually liberation? Or is she just assimilating into the same violent system that destroyed her life? Because Sadie gains respect and power within the gang, but she gains it by adopting their tools, guns, revenge, intimidation, she becomes effective within their framework by learning their language of violence. There's this theorist Frantz Fanon who wrote about colonial violence and the psychology of the oppressed. One of his arguments is that sometimes the only language the oppressor understands is violence, that appeals to morality or reason, don't work when you're dealing with systems built on force. And you could read Sadie's arc through that lens. The frontier is a violent patriarchal system. It took everything from her through violence. And the only way to function in that system, to have any agency at all, is to master its tools. But there's a cost to that. When you adopt the oppressor's methods, you internalize their logic. Violence becomes normalized. Revenge becomes purpose. The humanity you're trying to protect gets eroded by the methods you use to protect it. Sadie never loses her capacity for connection or emotion. She's not Micah, but she does become someone who can kill without much hesitation, who solves problems through force, who's more comfortable in conflict than in peace. And the game raises the question, what happens to her when the fighting's over? Can she put down the gun and build a normal life? Or has violence become so central to her identity that she doesn't know how to exist without it? This connects to a concept in gender studies called hegemonic masculinity. That's the dominant form of masculinity in a culture, the ideal that other masculinities are measured against. In the gang, hegemonic masculinity is about toughness, violence, emotional restraint, loyalty, reputation. And Sadie gains acceptance by performing a version of that. She becomes the woman who can fight. She's respected, but specifically because she's adopted masculine-coded behaviors. She's not changing the system. She's proving she can succeed within it by its own rules. That's assimilation, not transformation. The gang still fundamentally values violence and dominance. Sadie just demonstrated she can participate in those values as effectively as the men. So her liberation is real, but limited. She's not helpless anymore. She has skills, autonomy, respect. But she has those things within a system that's still fundamentally oppressive and violent. She's expanded what's possible for a woman in that context, but she hasn't changed the context itself. The survivor's dilemma. Choosing pragmatism. There's a crucial difference between Sadie and the male characters, and it shows up most clearly in how she thinks about the future. Arthur, John, even Dutch in his twisted way. They're caught up in narratives about honor, redemption, legacy. They make choices based on these romantic ideas about what their lives mean, what they're fighting for, whether they can be redeemed. Sadie doesn't have time for that. She's pragmatic. When the gang starts falling apart, she doesn't cling to loyalty or philosophy. She assesses the situation and makes survival-based decisions. This is psychologically significant. Male outlaw narratives in westerns are often about heroic death, about going down fighting, about sacrifice for a principle. There's this romanticization of violence and fatalism. But Sadie rejects that narrative. She wants to live, not just survive, actually live, build something beyond endless conflict. And she's willing to be clear-eyed about what that requires, even if it means leaving people behind. This is feminist rejection of the sacrificial narrative. Women in westerns are usually either helpless victims or tragic figures who die meaningfully. Sadie refuses both roles. She's neither passive nor fatalistic, and she lives. She survives the gang's destruction, survives the chaos of the end, and builds a life as a bounty hunter. Not a perfect life, not a peaceful life necessarily, but a life on her own terms where she's still in control. That survival is its own kind of resistance. In a genre where men die tragically and women watch them die, Sadie just keeps going, refuses the romance of death, chooses messy, complicated survival over clean, meaningful sacrifice. There's something psychologically mature about that. She's not trapped in the gang's mythology. She can see it clearly, participate in it when useful, and step away when necessary. That's a level of perspective and pragmatism that most of the male characters never achieve. The cost of strength, what gets lost. But we need to be honest about what Sadie's transformation costs her, because the game doesn't pretend trauma and violence don't leave marks. There's a hardness to Sadie by the end, a capacity for cruelty, a comfort with violence that wasn't there before. These aren't portrayed as purely positive traits. They're survival adaptations that serve her well in that context but narrow her as a person. She loses innocence, obviously, but more than that, she loses the possibility of certain kinds of connection. When you've been through what she's been through, when you've become what she's become, it's hard to relate to people who haven't. There's isolation in that strength. She can function alongside the gang, but she's fundamentally alone. Her grief is private. Her capacity for violence sets her apart. Even her friendship with Arthur or Charles has this quality of fellow survivors recognizing each other, not the easy camaraderie of people who haven't seen what they've seen. This is a realistic portrayal of trauma's long-term effects. You survive, you grow, you become capable, but you don't become undamaged. The trauma integrates into who you are. You carry it forward even as you move forward. In psychological terms, this is the difference between recovery and healing. Recovery means you can function again, maintain relationships, live your life. Healing means the wound closes and stops hurting. Sadie recovers. She's highly functional, but she doesn't heal. The wound is still there, it's just become part of her architecture now. She's built her strength around it, but that doesn't mean it's gone. And the game is honest about that ambiguity. Sadie is not presented as damaged goods who need saving, but she's also not presented as having transcended her trauma through strength. She's just living with it, making it work, using it as fuel when necessary and managing it when possible. That's probably the most realistic depiction of trauma survival you can have. Not the Hollywood version where you either stay broken or completely overcome it. Just the messy reality of carrying wounds while still living your life beyond symbols. A complete character. What makes Sadie work as a character is that she's not a symbol. She's not there to represent strong women or feminist ideals or any other abstraction. She's just a person. A psychologically complex person dealing with trauma, navigating systems not designed for her, making choices that are sometimes empowering and sometimes just pragmatic survival, carrying contradictions she never fully resolves. The game gives her genuine interiority. We see her grief, her rage, her moments of connection, and her moments of isolation. Her growth isn't linear. She doesn't have character beats where she learns lessons and improves. She just responds to circumstances, makes choices based on her evolving understanding of herself and the world, and deals with consequences. That's how real people work. And it's rare to see that applied to female characters in games, particularly in genres as male-dominated as Westerns. Her trauma is specific, not generic. It shaped her in particular ways based on who she was before, what she lost, what resources she had available. Two different people experiencing the same trauma would respond completely differently. Sadie's response is hers, not a template, and her strength isn't abstract or superhuman. It's situated, contextual, earned through specific experiences. She's not strong because the writers decided to make a strong female character. She's capable because she deliberately made herself capable as a trauma response, and that capability comes with specific psychological costs. This is what feminist theorists mean when they talk about situated knowledge and embodied experience. Sadie's gender matters, her trauma matters, her specific position in this specific social context matters. You can't extract her from those contexts and still understand her character. She's not universal or representative, she's particular, and that particularity is what makes her feel real. Sadie Adler is not a simple character. She's not strong female representation in the shallow sense where you just give a woman a gun and call it progress. She's a trauma survivor whose recovery looks like violence, a woman who disrupts gender norms without transcending them. Someone who reclaims agency through the exact tools that destroyed her life in the first place. A pragmatist who survives by refusing the romantic narratives that kill the men around her. Her psychology is complex. Post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth existing simultaneously, adaptive coping mechanisms that serve her well but also limit her. Identity reconstruction through narrative and action. The cost of strength and the isolation of survival, and sociologically, she's operating in this impossible space. Too feminine for complete acceptance in the gang's masculine culture, too masculine for conventional frontier femininity, creating a hybrid performance that challenges the binary without ever fully escaping it. The game doesn't resolve these tensions. Sadie rides off at the end still carrying her contradictions, still dangerous and still grieving, still strong and still wounded, still alone even when she's connected. And that's probably the most honest portrayal of trauma and survival you could ask for. Not transcendence, not defeat, just continuation. Still going, still fighting, still trying to figure out what life looks like when you've rebuilt yourself from scratch and aren't sure if the new version is better or just different. Sadie Adler matters, not because she's a feminist icon or a perfect representation. She matters because she's a complete character, messy, contradictory, psychologically complex, and deeply human, and in a genre built on masculine mythology and romantic violence, that humanity is quietly revolutionary. Thanks for watching.